Modern Russia was born on May 20th, 1887. It's a date you likely haven't seen in the history books. So why did it matter so much? On that day, an obscure revolutionary named Alexander Ulyanov was hanged for plotting to assassinate Tsar Alexander III. Normally, the incident would pass without remark, but this one turned out to be anything but normal. Alexander had a younger brother who never forgot what happened. His execution hardened the 17-year-old Vladimir and turned this pampered boy of a well-to-do bourgeois family into Lenin, the ultimate revolutionary. He would succeed beyond his brother's wildest dreams, drag Russia into modernity, and set the stage for today's geopolitics at a staggering cost. Millions dead in purges, war, and famine. Why did it come to that? What made him think the price was worth it? To begin, you need to find out why he believed the things he did. Fresh off his brother's execution, Vladimir was expelled from his first university for taking part in an illegal protest. The first brush with trouble made him even more determined. Most of us aren't sure what we would do in our turbulent 20s, but Vladimir was. By the time he was completed in his education, he was clear with his endgame. He was a dyed-in-the-wool Marxist who believed that democracy was just as incompatible with socialism as aristocracy. This was a vision that would drive him for the rest of his life. It was so powerful that his future wife Nada recalled that when he first met her, he was more interested in what she knew about the lives of the workers than he was in her. But Lenin would pay the price for this vision. He spent most of his life in exile. He was okay with this at the time. After all, Marx's theory believed that an international proletariat would overthrow capitalism everywhere, and Lenin wanted to link up with like-minded revolutionaries. It also helped that he could meet with his comrades without the Tsar's men constantly on his case. His brother's fate was never far from his mind. 1902 was an important year. Vladimir adopted the name Lenin. He also published a work that would most define his beliefs, What is to be Done. Why did this essay matter so much? Because it distinguished Lenin from Marx. You could say it transformed Marxism. Before Lenin, Marxism was shockingly neglectful of human agency. Marx believed that capitalism would eventually expand and then collapse under its own weight, almost as if it were a physical law of history. Lenin didn't agree. He thought that the proletariat would not overthrow capitalism on its own. Rather, something else was necessary, a vanguard party with close organic contact with the proletarian struggle. He also believed that it was possible to transition directly from monarchy to communism. Contrary to Marx, Lenin thought the intermediate step of a bourgeois capitalist democracy could be bypassed if the proletariat had proper organization. This was the dictatorship of the proletariat, which the vanguard party needed to create. This was why the party, led by a revolutionary elite that could actually get the job done and not just think about it, needed to be supreme. But these ideas annoyed a lot of people. They split the Russian socialist movement into Lenin's Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks, who preferred a loosely organized democratic party that was open to compromise. Unfortunately for Lenin, his Bolsheviks were in the minority, and his ideas wound up costing him influence. He was on the outs. The proof of his powerlessness came in 1905. Revolution broke out in Russia because the Tsarist regime was more competent at shooting nonviolent protesters than at shooting the enemy in the Russo-Japanese War. Lenin was excited, but he had no influence. It frustrated him deeply. The Tsar came so close to being overthrown, but he correctly predicted that the revolutionary would end with an illusion of liberal reform. There was now a national legislature, the Duma, but the Tsar's authority was basically the same. Instead, the most notable development for Lenin that year was his acquaintance with a Georgian at a Bolshevik conference in Finland. This man was the only one who had the gall to attack Lenin there. The delegates were stunned into silence. Unexpectedly, Lenin invited his attacker to draft the revolution they argued about. The man's name was Joseph Vissarionovich, soon to be known as Stalin. It was the beginning of a relationship that would remain complicated even after Lenin's death. But that was in the future. For now, Lenin was the respected but powerless leader of a powerless faction. The coming years in exile would be hard for him. He frequently needed to rely on his bourgeois mother for money, caring little for the irony. He may have been defeated at the time, but his beliefs were as fervent as ever. Another opportunity came a decade later. Most people don't like it when they hear that a war has broken out. Lenin wasn't like most people. The carnage of 1914 thrilled him. He gleefully rooted for Russia's defeat. For him, this massacre at the direction of capitalist imperialist powers was the great invitation for the international proletariat to unite and usher in socialism. It didn't work out like that. Lenin watched aghast as socialist parties throughout Europe lined up behind their respective national war efforts. Lenin could take solace in one thing, though. His wish for Russia to lose was becoming a reality. The Tsar was incompetent in this war, as he was in the last, with millions of more casualties. By February 1917, the Russian public had enough. Poorly supplied soldiers at the front mutinied. On the 22nd, steelworkers in Petrograd went on strike. The protests swelled up to 200,000 people, demanding the end of the war and the monarchy. When Nicholas II ordered soldiers to suppress the revolt, they refused and joined in. With no support, he abdicated. The Duma formed a provisional government, but it was even more unstable. The Tsar had centuries of tradition behind him. What was this provisional government thing? Most importantly, the provisional government didn't end the war with Germany, so most people saw it as an institution meant to serve the wealthy and aristocracy. That's why there was another organization that competed with it for authority, the Petrograd Soviet. In fact, the Soviet usually had more practical power than the provisional government. Lenin watched these developments restlessly from exile in Switzerland. The Soviet was his best chance to seize power. The time had come for him to go home and lead the Bolsheviks. But how to get there? He couldn't cross the front lines. Germany was happy to help. It was also desperate to win the war and saw this obscure fanatic as a way to cause even more chaos in Russia. The Germans even gave him some money. It was a decision that would haunt them for the rest of the 20th century. Home for the first time in many years, Lenin worked to increase the Bolsheviks' influence in the Soviet. He started a massive propaganda campaign, starring a publication you might have heard of, Pravda. Stalin was on the editorial board and demonstrated his ability to put Lenin's ideas into practice. There were riots in Petrograd, the July days when workers and members of the military were fed up with the provisional government's ongoing offensive at the front, which ended in yet another disastrous defeat. Stalin helped organize this uprising. The provisional government put it down, but the experience sent a shiver down its spine. Concerned about the growing radicalization of the Soviet, it ordered the arrest of Bolshevik leaders. Lenin's ally, Leon Trotsky, was nabbed. Pravda was raided too, but Stalin was a savvy guy. He escaped and smuggled Lenin to safety. The arrests did nothing to stop the Bolsheviks' growing influence on the Russian left. Quite the contrary, just as Lenin predicted so long ago, the Mensheviks' idea to get along with everyone had led to a willingness to compromise with the provisional government. The provisional government's unpopularity rubbed off them as a result, and Lenin had triumphed over his former rivals. Soon, the provisional government needed to release the arrested Bolsheviks at the Soviets' demand. It would need them soon. Supposedly intending to liberate Russia from the influence of radical socialists, the commander-in-chief of the Russian army, Vladimir Kornilov, attempted a coup. He failed, but the provisional government needed the help of those same radical socialists to suppress his insurrection. Naturally, the Bolsheviks felt emboldened and were ready to flex their new muscle. In September, with the German armies threatening Petrograd and tensions high, Leon Trotsky became the chairman of the Petrograd Soviet and head of the Military Revolutionary Committee created on October 10th to protect the city from future coup attempts. Naturally, this meant that Bolsheviks infiltrated the army, and by now, they had achieved an electoral majority in the Soviet workers' section. They had a lot of pull with the sailors at the naval base at Kronstadt, too. Trotsky also created a militia called the Red Guard. Lenin's dream of converting the Soviet to Bolshevism had been realized. He returned to Petrograd on the same day, sensing the urgency of the moment. The provisional government was fading fast, and the Bolsheviks' power was at a crescendo. Lenin was happy, but anxious. The government had the word provisional in it for a reason. It had called for an election in November to create a permanent government. The Bolsheviks may have increased their influence a lot, but they were still a tiny band that would not do well in the election. Plus, the Germans were still threatening Petrograd, and they could change everything. The time had come. If Lenin wanted to seize power, it was now or never. The Bolsheviks had a problem, though. Only 6,000 troops in Petrograd's 160,000-man garrison were Bolsheviks. Hoping to take advantage of this, the provisional government's leader, Alexander Kerensky, ordered the garrison to take action against the Bolsheviks at their headquarters in the Somny Institute. Unfortunately for Kerensky, he was even less popular than the Bolsheviks were. The troops held key points through the city like bridges, but did not move on the Bolsheviks. On October 24th, November 7th on the current calendar, the Red Guards mobilized in Petrograd and seized those same key points in the city. The garrison simply didn't care to fight them for Kerensky's sake. The provisional government's headquarters at the Winter Palace was the only area where the Bolsheviks met resistance. The battle was tough and lasted all day, as a few hundred armed cadets held out against 40,000 attackers. The Bolsheviks brought up artillery and fired on the palace, but resistance remained strong. The climactic moment came when the cruiser Aurora from the Kronstadt Naval Base came up to support the troops on the ground. The ship could only fire blanks, but it added to the psychological terror. The Red Guards entered the palace shortly after the Aurora arrived. There, they encountered the determined cadets, including members of the Women's Death Battalion, who held out bravely. The battle lasted into the small hours of the 25th. Nevertheless, the cadets' efforts were futile. They surrendered, and the provisional government with them. Only Kerensky managed to flee. The Bolsheviks were in control of the capital. The new Congress of Soviets, which met 2 days after the Petrograd coup, declared a new socialist government. At last, Lenin had realized the dream he had since his brother's execution so many years before. But the biggest challenge was ahead. Now that he had power, he needed to keep it. Only the Bolsheviks had taken part in the October Revolution. Other leftist groups, like the Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries, had not supported the violence. Perhaps unwisely, these groups quit the Soviet in protest. Wasting no time, Lenin created a new all-Bolshevik executive body, the Council of People's Commissars, with himself as chairman. Trotsky and Stalin were there too. Reluctantly, Lenin allowed the election the provisional government had organized to go ahead. As he had long expected, the Bolsheviks did not do well, coming in a distant second with 25% of the vote to the socialist revolutionaries' 42%. For him, the result confirmed everything he had long believed. Socialism could not come through democracy. A well-organized party was required to guide the revolutionary proletariat. Lenin wanted to shut down the new Constitutes Assembly before it even convened. He didn't. He allowed it to meet for 1 day. It declared Russia a republic and adjourned. Lenin then posted armed guards and prevented it from meeting again. Without any shame, he claimed he was carrying out the people's will. Soon, he banned all other political parties. The Bolsheviks would rule as the dictatorship of the proletariat he had long advocated. Lenin instead sought to consolidate his power by carrying out his ideals. He nationalized finance and industry, redistributed land to the peasantry, and declared the end of all distinctions between class and nationality, ending the old imperial system of exploitation. Lenin's stated goals were to deliver peace, land, bread, and freedom. But even as he announced these grand plans, Lenin contradicted himself and formed his own secret police, the Cheka, precursor to the KGB. Its goal? Suppress counter-revolutionary activities. He would use it a lot. Above all, he needed to end the war. and even here, he tried to have it both ways. He no longer prosecuted the fighting, but tried to avoid signing a peace agreement because he thought a socialist revolution, just like the one he had led, would break out in a war-fatigued Germany. He was right, but his timing proved disastrous. Lenin was way too early. So the German armies advanced again and forced the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk on Lenin's government. It was a humiliation. Russia gave up territory stretching from the Baltic to the Caucasus. These lands contained a third of the old empire's population, 90% of its coal, and 50% of its industry. Things would get worse. Throughout 1918, Lenin's drive to turn Russia into a one-party state, including by murdering the exiled Tsarist family in Yekaterinburg, made him even more enemies. There were 3 attempts on Lenin's life. The third was the most serious. Lenin was shot twice on October 30th. Blood got into his lungs. His health was never the same. Russia wouldn't be either. Enemies were knocking down the Bolsheviks' doors. First, there were the Whites, the opponents of the communist Reds. The Whites were a multi-crew of dissident revolutionaries on the left and counter-revolutionaries on the right. Still, they posed a big threat, and they had the support of foreign powers that landed troops on Russian soil as their war with Germany wound down. The newly independent Poland declared war on Russia as well. The pressure was enormous. The Bolsheviks responded with the Red Terror. Perceived enemies were arrested, exiled, or executed. Historians debate the number of people killed. Some put it as low as 50,000, and others say it was as high as 2 million. Millions more were dying from something else. The Reds had good fortune in the war. They were much better organized than the Whites. The public in the United States, Britain, France, and Japan had little appetite for action in Russia after years of brutal warfare with Germany, so the foreign troops left. The war with Poland started badly, but Russia was able to rally. It lost control of parts of western Ukraine and Belarus, but was in a much better position than the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk put it in. But one of the worst disasters of the 20th century was the cost of this victory. The Bolsheviks enacted a policy of war communism to win. Going back on his promises to peasants, Lenin's government confiscated grain to keep the Red Army in the field. Drought in 1921 made bad conditions even worse. 5 million more Russians died. The seizure of industry was backfiring as well. Many factories closed down since they weren't profitable anymore. Bolshevik management policies at the surviving factories led to increased tensions with the workers, as here too, the party went back on its promises. With little say in their workplaces, many of the proletariat left the cities. Lenin was defiant on the surface. He justified all of these actions based on his idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat. With a straight face, he claimed that the class most oppressed by capitalism is entitled to use compulsion. But beneath this dogmatism, Lenin realized he needed to do something, maybe change his whole way of thinking, fast. He might be winning the Civil War, but what would he have left at this rate? With little choice, Lenin issued the new economic policy in the spring of 1921, and it was a total 180 from everything he believed in his adult lifetime. Grudgingly, he said that the elements of the capitalist economic system could continue, while large enterprises would remain collectivized under the state. Small enterprises like factories and farms would be allowed to do business for profit. Lenin almost twisted himself into a pretzel just to justify this shift. He claimed that the war's destruction of capitalist industry had meant the reduction of the proletariat as a conscious class. The NEP would lead to a revived proletariat with state power capable of restraining capitalism in the end, or so he said. The NEP also opened Russia to badly needed humanitarian aid from the United States. This helped with the famine. Even so, the Bolsheviks now exported grain to raise money, infuriating the Americans. But for Lenin, it all worked out. The worst was over. The Red Army recaptured Vladivostok in October 1922, ending the Civil War. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republic was officially created 2 months later. Lenin would not live long to enjoy this victory. In the chaos of the Civil War, the Reds began to turn Lenin into a saint. He denounced this. It was inconsistent with socialism. They went ahead anyway, but the chasm between the savvy, determined Lenin of the posters and the haggard reality of Lenin, the man, widened every day. Already in bad health, Lenin suffered several strokes between 1922 and 1923 that left him with speaking difficulties and partial paralysis. The posters kept going on the walls, and the statues were being built in public squares. But in private, the Bolsheviks, now officially the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, inevitably began debating who would succeed him. A frail Lenin had a lot of doubts about one claimant. Joseph Stalin had proven himself more than once. He was a man who could put Lenin's ideas into action and might have saved his life in 1917. But capable as he was, Lenin thought Stalin had too many disqualifying traits. He considered the Georgian rude, impatient, capricious, and not intellectually up to the job. Stalin was even verbally abusive to Nadia. Lenin regretted his appointment as General Secretary of the Communist Party. Seeing that the end was near, he made a will in December 1922. He did not explicitly name a successor, but clearly preferred Trotsky, much to Stalin's dismay when he heard it read aloud. Lenin died in 1924. Petrograd was named Leningrad in his honor. Against his wife's wishes, his body was mummified and put on display in a mausoleum in Moscow's Red Square, where it remains today. His will was not fulfilled. Stalin was in a better position than Trotsky and seized the opportunity. He took charge of the funeral, bolstering the personality cult he was already creating in tandem with Lenin's. Though not without a fight, Stalin would indeed succeed Lenin, but that story's for another day. There's no doubt that Lenin changed Russia and the world. Even after the Soviet Union's fall in 1991, communist parties retained power in China and North Korea, using Lenin's ideas to justify their rule and hostility to the Western democratic capitalist powers. The ironic thing about this is that Marx would have never predicted socialism could come there, because they had been so underdeveloped. But Lenin's ideas of a disciplined party organization that would guide the proletariat to a revolutionary dictatorship proved so influential and effective that it transcended Marxism to its original form. Marx was the thinker, Lenin was the doer, with dramatic consequences. What do you think about Lenin? Was he a basically well-intentioned revolutionary under enormous pressure, or was he always a tyrant in the making, just like his unchosen successor, Joseph Stalin? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. If you enjoyed today's video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories of people that changed the world. Thanks for watching. Until next time, never stop learning.